It's election night, and the one thing we can confidently predict is that predictions from partisans and overeager social media pundits are flying left and right. So instead of tossing out wild guesses based on, let's say, exit polls or vibes, we thought we'd spend some time considering what actually happened over the last 4 months. From the second this race changed during the June debate between Donald Trump and Joe Biden, to Biden endorsing Kamala Harris, to the dueling speeches at Madison Square Garden and on the National Mall last week. So as we Americans go to vote this week, these are the moments that are swimming in our heads. If there are vibes, these are the stories behind them. This race really started back in November 2022 as Donald Trump announced his intent to run for the Republican nomination. Biden announced in April of 2023 that he'd run for re-election, saying, quote, "Let's finish the job." So back then, about 40% of the country viewed Joe Biden unfavorably, similar to now. His unfavorables climbed from about 53% to about 55%. When Trump announced, his numbers were in a similar place, but have now improved to 52 unfavorable, 45 favorable. Kamala Harris, meanwhile, suffered a massive deficit in her favorability ratings throughout the Biden administration, but climbed after stepping into the race to about 50% unfavorable and 47% favorable by Election Day. That is a 10-point increase in her favorables since last year, most of which came just over the last few months. So joining us now to make sense of the numbers as they roll in tonight with a big picture perspective, from the pets of Springfield, Ohio, to Robert F. Kennedy Jr., we're extremely lucky to be joined for this analysis by two expert guests. The first is Roy Texiera of the American Enterprise Institute and the excellent Liberal Patriot Substack. The second is Philip Wegmann of Real Clear Politics, where he's covered the White House and the campaigns and been on the trail and in the briefing room. Gentlemen, thank you for being here.
Thanks for having us.
All right, so we have about 10 big moments, and they're the obvious ones, but we want to talk about them through the less than obvious lens. And the first would be the Trump and Biden debate. The obvious lens here is we get 10 minutes into it, and Joe Biden says, "We beat Medicare." Amazing moment. Amazing moment.
Well, plus after that, Trump says, "I don't know what he just said, and frankly, I don't think he does either." I think that was the death knell.
So, Roy, you followed this really closely, and in terms of like where Biden was seen by the public, even going into that debate, he really wasn't that strong. We sort of look back on it as that was a hard pivot, but Biden's numbers haven't been strong throughout his presidency. Is that correct?
Yeah, that is correct. Absolutely. Mm-hmm.
So what was it, do you think, with people? Is it the economy, the Biden economy? Was it immigration? I mean, obviously these are still on the table between Trump and Harris, but looking to explain why Biden came into the race in a weak position, is that really where it was coming from?
Yeah, I mean, basically people's assessment of the Biden administration and its policies and how this life has been under Biden was not positive at all. I mean, people, despite the pickup of the economy in the last period of time, people experienced the first period as a spike in inflation, which affected their living standards, cost of living. I mean, basically, he got elected, let's not forget this, to restore normalcy.
Right.
He did not have a mandate to do anything in particular other than that. Get the economy right, get the COVID pandemic right, calm things down back to normal. That really didn't happen as far as people were concerned. I mean, either in the economy or what happened at the border or the general sort of tenor of culture war-related issues as they unfolded in the Biden administration, where clearly they moved to the left relative to where a lot of people were. Did not really tack to the center on any of this stuff. I mean, crime's another obvious example, race, gender, what have you. It was a pretty down-the-line, left-oriented, cultural left-oriented stance on a lot of these issues. And that combined with the chaos at the border, the problems with the economy, the disorder in the cities. I mean, people just said, hey, I wanted normal, I didn't get normal. So, people were upset and they blamed the Biden administration for it.
Philip, you cover the White House in addition to covering the campaigns, so I'm curious what you were seeing behind the scenes actually before that debate. Did the White House sense that, because my sense, just to put my cards on the table, was that the White House underestimated Biden's weakness going into that debate, but was that just cope because everyone was desperately trying to stave off the inevitable, the unthinkable really, that a presidential candidate would drop out after all the votes were cast?
Yeah, I think, Roy, you're absolutely right. It was a number of those things that there was false advertising. The American public was sold normal, and instead they got a little bit of chaos, starting with the withdrawal from Afghanistan. It wasn't just one thing. It was a confluence of all of them. But in the summer of 2021, when Americans saw chaos on their cable news screens, and then they were reminded of all of these other things that were not going well. It invited them to doubt the president himself and whether or not he was totally in control. This White House has been very, very good in terms of keeping Biden in bubble wrap, keeping him away from the cameras. The moments that have really hurt him have been when he has spoken off the cuff, whether it was, a minor incursion into Ukraine, whether it was doubting the legitimacy of the 2022 midterms. For the most part, though, they were successful. They kept him on script. They kept him within hours of the day where he could be effective. That changes at the debate, because I think that some of the people who are in Biden's inner circle, they certainly knew that he might not be on the same level that he once was, that he had good days and bad days. But at that debate, that's when it was apparent for 90 minutes that, no, this is who Joe Biden is.
You
he
were
has
there,
lost
right?
a step. Yeah.
So take us into the room. What were, because
Yeah.
that's a historic moment in the country, not just this election.
Look, we want to cover the fact that Joe Biden is the oldest president in U.S. history, right? That is part of the story no matter what. And in my experience with him, he had good days and he had bad days. When he was really on and he was hammering a point that he was passionate about, he seemed no different than he was back during the 2020 primary. But on moments when he would get rattled, a different kind of Joe Biden would show up. Often he would be angry. He got angry at me during one press conference. But I remember at that debate, I was talking with California Governor Gavin Newsom, and he told me beforehand as he's walking through the spin room that Joe Biden always shows up for these big moments.
Wow.
That he has never let the Democratic Party down. And that's sort of true, right? Because he had just done what Hillary Clinton couldn't do. He had just done what Obama didn't think he could do. He had defeated Donald Trump. And then at the Atlanta debate, we see that, he lost something off of his fastball. And I remember the moment when Gavin Newsom was back in the spin room, probably about 45 minutes after the debate ended. And I heard someone shout, "Sir, are you ready to take over the ticket for Biden?" And I thought, okay, well, that's kind of a snarky question. Which small conservative outlet asked that? And I turned around. And I think it was the BBC. The veil had been broken, and now the age issue was front and center, and it was inescapable.
Well, let's not forget, even before then, obviously, there was rumblings about, he had lost many miles off his fastball, many examples thereof, which, as you point out, they were well managed by the Biden White House. And let's face it, the media helped them on this. They did not want to delve. They did not want to delve into this. They did not want to know. But it was obvious to normie voters that something wasn't quite right. And he was running poorly against Trump already. But that was a straw that breaks the camel's back as a debate performance, when even the people propping him up said, okay, just let him fall backwards. This is not going to work.
And I want to get into that, actually, because I was tempted to put one of the top moments of this last election cycle as when Biden froze up at that Juneteenth ceremony. There was viral video of him. Everyone is clapping along to the musical performance, and Joe Biden freezes, seems to lose his sense of where he is, his lucidity, and that went so viral. Then he had a gaffe on the 4th of July. And then in the lead up to all of this, we're hearing about cheap fakes from a lot of people in the legacy media warning voters, be aware, these aren't all, some of this is getting clipped out of context. Obama and Biden on stage at that fundraiser. But then Nancy Pelosi, after the debate, goes on what is reported to be President Biden's absolute favorite news show, which is Morning Joe, and does not have a clear support, does not offer her clear support to Joe
she was
Biden.
Already sharpening the knife, let's face it.
So Roy, that's my question for you. So you understand the machinations in the Democratic Party to the extent that we can, and you've been around some of these power brokers. How meaningful was that appearance by Nancy Pelosi?
I think it was very meaningful. They were already thinking it through. They were probably talking to each other. I think even before the debate, there's obviously sub rosa, sort of chats going on about, let's hope he makes it, but what if he doesn't? So I think they were ready. And I think sort of that top tier, Schumer, Pelosi, Obama, they were pretty ready already. And then they went into emergency mode after the debate and said, okay, we basically got to start setting this up. We can't push him out today, but we have to set it up. So I think it's a really fascinating thing that we'll eventually know from historians exactly the sort of timeline of all this and who talked to who when decisions were made. But even not knowing that much about it, I think it's a pretty good guess that they were, pretty determined to get rid of him right then and there. But they just didn't know quite how to do it to begin with.
Right. And that was a huge decision, was Nancy Pelosi. Well, I'll save this because I was going to talk about this sort of mini primary idea, but we'll talk about that in a moment. What was your sense of how meaningful the Pelosi appearance was? And I want to just ask that in the context of all of the down ballot candidates that she, as somebody who was in this position to try to keep her House majority for years and years, is looking at a close House map and thinking about all of these candidates now that are going to be asked whether they support Joe Biden over and over again, with a majority of the country thinking he should get the heck out of the race. Was that sense from Democratic insiders weighing on them and on Nancy Pelosi?
Barack Obama didn't do his own dirty work. He sent George Clooney to write that op-ed. Chuck Schumer sat on the fence. Nancy Pelosi sat at the table and actually did the job. And it's painful. She knew how painful it was for her to say on his favorite show that he watches more often than not that Joe Biden needs to make a decision at a moment when Biden had already said numerous times at that point, I made my decision, I'm staying in. And
Great
Pelosi's like, well, no, you need to make the right decision. What is ironic in retrospect is I believe that Morning Joe appearance was on July 10th. The next day, what happens? Biden goes to the NATO summit, and he has a press conference immediately following. This is a gamble because you never know what's going to come out of a Biden press conference.
We had just opened this office, and everyone was watching with bated breath. We had a bunch of other reporters over as we were literally assembling the chairs, and the tension was so palpable because we didn't know if he was going to make it through like he did not at the debate, which was prior to that, his last unscripted, unprompted type of situation.
And the bar was pretty low after that debate. And Biden cleared it. The White House, they were more than happy. They were able to say, look, it was just a bad night. He did well in this press conference. Two things are interesting from that press conference. He was asked towards the end if his campaign came to him with internal numbers showing that Kamala Harris had a better chance of defeating Donald Trump, would he step aside? And he was like, yeah, but the numbers don't show that. Later on, they very much did show that. And someone had leaked to the New York Times that day that the Biden campaign was running polling of Harris v. Trump. But more significant than the press conference itself is when Biden is introducing Zelensky to the summit. And he calls him Vladimir Putin.
Oh, he did do that. I actually forgot about
It's hard to remember all this stuff.
The
Let's
air
face
is
it.
left out of that room.
And you were in there.
Audible gasp was in the room.
Right. Well, at least he wasn't dead, though. He wasn't
It was
still kicking.
recognizing
incredibly
dead
uncomfortable.
I see
And
dead
again,
people.
his whole point is that he's the candidate who can defend democracy.
Right,
now
right.
he's introducing an ally as an enemy.
Yeah. No, as a total, can we say clusterfuck?
Yeah, of course we can, because it's what it was.
So, but again, to me, it's interesting how the mechanics of getting rid of him evolved from an idea to full-scale operation, get rid of Biden, with everybody, all their ducks in a row. Everybody knew what to say. Everybody was ready the moment Harris got put up to basically call every friggin' delegate and get, for the convention and get them on board. It was a masterful operation, I mean, who cares about this democracy stuff? We just got to get rid of Biden and beat this, it was impressive.
The enemy's at the gates.
The enemy's at the gates, absolutely. Yeah.
And the dates here, speaking of the word enemies, the dates here are critical because you just mentioned the NATO summit being, July 10th. So we're going from that June debate, last week of June, NATO summit July 10th, roughly, and then, oh my gosh, Donald Trump gets shot in the head on July 13th in Butler, Pennsylvania. It's another one we were watching in here as we were assembling chairs, and it was so surreal. I'm sure all of us had the same experience watching this happen. Completely surreal. Upends the race as it had already been upended in this historic way, with the sitting president of the United States failing to make it through 10 minutes of a debate without a major, seemingly medical issue hitting him, or gaffe, however you want to say it. So, Roy, that happens in Butler, Pennsylvania. A man named Corey Comparatore, a retired firefighter, is killed in the stands by this assassin. Butler, Pennsylvania, the home of the Jeep, actually, interestingly enough. And they're very proud of it in Butler if you go there, which I didn't realize at the time until I actually went. What does that do to Donald Trump's base in the context of Election Day, early voting? We've seen a lot more Republicans voting early. How did that fundamentally change the way he was running in his own party? To the extent that maybe...
Well, I don't know. Did it really? Or is it really more it sort of consolidated the change on the Democratic side? Because once this happens, it clearly is on net a benefit for the Trump campaign. Biden's not going to do any better. He's probably going to do worse. So it's on July 21st, right, that they finally, the hammer comes down, and he has to. And I think that was probably shortly after that. They were looking at the polling data. They were thinking, how are we going to beat this guy? Like fight. I mean, well, okay. Our polling suggests Harris would do better. So basically, we really got to start working Joe over. And it took a while, I think. They had, it's like a prize fight or something. They had to keep punching him. And finally, they got the TKO and he got out of the way. But I think probably if I'm them, it's in that period after the assassination attempt that you realize we got to move quick. We got to get rid of this guy. We're not going to beat Trump otherwise.
So for obvious reasons, you go to, actually, if you go back to Butler now, if you go to rural Virginia, I was driving around King George County in Virginia over the weekend, and the signs have Trump with fight on it. So obviously, for obvious reasons, you can understand why people would put that iconic moment on their signs. I wonder, is that a moment that's in everybody's heads when they're deciding whether or not they're too busy to vote on Tuesday?
I really don't know. It's a good question. I don't have a good sense of it. There's so much other stuff that's happened since then, which is part of the beauty of, the switcheroo, right? Because that really stepped on the whole momentum and sort of the image people had and replaced it with other stuff. Whereas I think if Biden had stuck in there, it would have been easier for people to remember that in a more vivid way than they probably do at this point. There's just too much other stuff that's happened since then, and a completely new race and all this. So.
Right, that makes sense. And you went back to Butler for that second rally. Just give us the inside scoop from your sources. How did they react in Trump world when that happened, and Biden world too?
Yeah, inside Trump world, the most common reaction was they're trying to kill him. And they never quite defined exactly who they were. But the assassination attempt, the first and then the second, what it did to the Republican base is it took a symbolic martyrdom and it made it visceral. And a lot of these MAGA supporters who were going to show up no matter what were motivated that much more because they saw their hero almost die. And I think that that led to a bit of humility, knowing that, he's just flesh and blood. It humanized him. But did it move the numbers? I think it, more than anything, energized Republicans. It certainly brought Elon Musk off the sidelines, along with all of his many millions of dollars. I think the more interesting effect was, as Trump is let off the stage and is defiant, Biden, who was already on the ropes in an unusual race as it was, now has to go against a figure who has become sort of an icon in that moment. So yeah, to your point, Roy, I mean, I think Democrats were looking at this and thinking, all right, now we have to beat a martyr as well.
Right. Do you think that an unintended consequence of this, or undervalued consequence of this, is obviously, their hero almost gets shot. He just really gets shot. He just doesn't get killed. Do you think it brought out the crazy more than otherwise would have been true among his supporters, which is actually to the benefit of the Democrats, right?
It's a good question. Certainly, I think, I was hearing after the assassination attempt that Donald Trump had fundamentally changed. And I was hearing this from people who were really close to him.
We're about to get to this,
and had talked to him. So I think it made people more comfortable talking in existential terms.
Well, okay, so that's a perfect transition. Yeah. The next moment, number 4 here, was going to be Donald Trump's RNC speech. Were you at the RNC, Roy?
I was not.
Okay.
I watched it on television.
Okay, so...
And it was made for television.
It was made for television, very much made for television. In fact, Donald Trump's speech and his entrance to his speech, it was produced like a Vegas show. And at the RNC... the way I would describe it after the assassination attempt, because people have asked, what's the difference between the RNC and the DNC? Everyone seemed so happy. They thought they were going to win at the RNC. I would say the DNC was legitimately joyful. People had this catharsis, and we'll get to that too. But at the RNC, I thought there was almost sobriety, like there was a gravity. People thought they were going to win, but they were almost serious about that rather than joyful about it because their guy had just been shot. That was kind of different. So maybe I'll start with you here, Philip. Trump starts speaking, gives a pretty good speech. And then I had a view of the teleprompter. He starts going off prompter. You didn't need to look at the teleprompter to know that. and went on to talk for almost 2 hours, right? If I'm remembering correctly.
Was it 2 hours?
It was a long
Pretty close.
speech. It was close.
He covered everything from electric vehicles to his friendship with Kim Jong-un. I mean, the first 20 minutes.
Right. He was doing the weave.
Yeah, he was doing the weave.
Doing the weave.
And I don't know if that served him very well. You would see conservatives who would argue, look, just meet the moment. You have an easy setup here, which is you can return to defiant rhetoric about how you will continue to run in the face of danger. And instead, he returned to some of his usual grievances. At the same time, while the 90-minute or 2-hour speech, I forget exactly what it was, didn't do him any favors, maybe. Republicans left the RNC thinking that they were invincible. There was a thought that Joe Biden couldn't drop out at that point. And I was talking to someone who was in the Trump White House who said, look, I'm waiting for the other shoe to drop. I'm waking up every morning pinching myself because Republicans have never gotten this many positive headlines. We've never been that unified. Remember, you had Nikki Haley and Ron DeSantis come back and throw their support behind Donald Trump. Certainly, Republicans felt like they could not lose leaving Milwaukee, and then that shoe it dropped.
Yeah, Roy. In the Beltway, there was a clear narrative that Trump's speech showed nothing had really changed in him personally. We had heard, and your sources were telling you, he's really a different man, and maybe he is a different man publicly. Though he reverted pretty much to form. Does that matter as much as the Beltway says? Could there have been a version of Trump that was much more sober and focused, gives that scripted speech, walks off stage, drops the microphone, has an easier next couple of months, coasts into today? Or was it always going to be like this?
Well, I think the ending of the speech, at the margin, it kind of hurt him a little bit, but it really wouldn't have mattered if it hadn't been an indicator of how he was going to do the rest of the campaign. I think it was like if he had actually stuck to his speech, kept it short, walked off, and kept on doing stuff like that, I think he would have a significant lead at this point. But the way he sort of backed into the weave after his intended speech was an indicator of how he's going to run the rest of the campaign, which is going to be wires hanging from the ceiling, weaving all over the place, saying bizarre things. It was going to basically walk into the narrative that Democrats were going to tell about him, that the media was going to cover, and that was going to make, sort of swingish, more moderate voters nervous. So I think, so in other words, the ending of the speech didn't matter that much in itself, but it did tell us the way that the campaign might move, which is, not optimizing for Trump.
So Democrats obviously absorb this, and immediately, not immediately, but pretty close after the RNC, even though Trump does the weave, Joe Biden drops out. Not only does he drop out, but he endorses Kamala Harris.
Yeah.
How significant is that instant endorsement of Kamala Harris?
Well, the thing I think was significant is you didn't see Nancy Pelosi with the knife right behind him as he made his statement. So I think that was well managed.
Yeah, she wasn't hovering over him like Hitchcock. Yeah.
Right.
So we could have stopped and said it was significant, A, that Biden dropped out, B, that he endorsed Kamala Harris. But then what happens is with that endorsement, and he knows this, they don't go to the mini primary format that everybody had been buzzing about. And they don't find a way to do this in an election where they're running on saving democracy and returning to normalcy. They do this in the least normal, arguably least democratic way, where you didn't go back and have average voters go to the polls and find someone else.
You don't need the voters.
But yeah,
That would be a bad idea.
And practically that would have been very difficult. But
right.
As you're covering that, what on earth are Democrats, how are they reacting in real time? Especially you cover the White House. So my understanding is that a lot of people in the White House didn't know Biden was going to drop out.
No, they didn't.
So they really had no plan after that happened other than Kamala Harris.
There were a number of White House staffers who were almost like the last Imperial Japanese soldier at the end of the Second World War, insisting up until the very end that Biden wasn't going to go anywhere, and he was as sharp as ever. In fact, White House Press Secretary Karine Jean-Pierre, after the Atlanta debate, said, Sky is totally the same. Nothing has changed.
Sharp as a tack.
And then all of a sudden we get our first presidential resignation by Twitter. And I think that it took a few hours before he endorsed Harris. Certainly, he cleared the field for her. But yeah, there's a tension and an irony there. Joe Biden said his entire campaign was about saving democracy, and then in the most undemocratic manner, he elevates his vice president.
Yeah, to me, that is such a significant moment in the campaign, that this switch out is accomplished so smoothly with almost like ruthless precision. And, within like 48 hours, everything's settled. We know who's going to be the nominee. We know it's Kamala Harris. We know everything, and it's remarkable. I mean, it still makes my head spin to think of it, how seamlessly they pulled it off. And I think that, the extent they had success after that with the Harris campaign, that was a predicate for it. They had to make it really happen fast, no dissent, no nothing, and then, we'll roll the dice and see what happens. And they got incredible media coverage after that.
Well, I don't think we should get away from this, because obviously these couple of months removed, we just talk about this in the rearview mirror. This is unprecedented. This is massive. We don't know whether or not, Pelosi broached the 25th Amendment again. We don't know what those conversations were exactly like. But I think that it's notable that here in Joe Biden, you have someone who dedicated his entire life to this office. And not just him, so did his family. This has been their life's ambition. And over the course of a couple of weeks, he was convinced, no, you need to step aside. You need to get out of the way. And I think there's a case to be made among some Democrats that Biden was actually, pretty magnanimous, not only in that he stepped aside for Harris. We've heard her make that argument even at the DNC, but that, he tried to throw his weight behind her. Obviously, he doesn't have a lot of political capital to lend at the moment, and he's, more trouble than he's worth sometimes. But, this has been his life's goal, and he gave it up. So,
He's a good soldier.
Yeah. Well, how do you think that actually played with voters, Roy? Because I don't think people are going to the polls on Election Day today and saying, all right, I'm coloring in this Trump bubble specifically because they cooed Joe Biden. But I have to imagine that did hurt Democrats' ability to make that pro-democracy argument, to send Liz Cheney out to the suburbs of Wisconsin. What do you make of that?
Did it? I don't know. I mean, again, it was so elegantly and cleanly done.
That's true.
And there was enough time for people to forget a little bit.
That's true.
And, they have a whole vector of things they can talk about in terms of democracy, saving democracy on the ballot, fascism. I mean, it's not like they backed off from that after, the coup, quote unquote, against Biden. They sort of happily proceeded with their standard rap about Republicans. Danger to democracy, Trump, he's crazy. His first day in office, he'll be a dictator, it'll be a bloodbath. They didn't retire any of the tropes, really, that I can think of. So, out there somewhere, are there some swing voters who otherwise would have been interested in voting for the Democrats, but because of this coup-like change, feel like they don't buy it anymore? They don't think the Democrats are a Democratic Party? I don't really have that sense. I mean, I think it's more among people who are already questioning the Democrats' democratic bona fides to begin with, kind of reinforce that. But I don't know. I mean, it's an interesting question. I mean, I would say on net, clearly they benefited from getting Biden out of the way. I mean, was this not as much of a benefit as it would have been if they had done things in a more democratic way? I'm really not so sure about that. I mean, I think the reason they did it the way they did it wasn't just because they're ruthless, though they are, but because it really would have been a can of worms to make it more open process. I mean, you can imagine the race and gender card playing. You can imagine the brutal infighting. You can imagine, it was like they felt it was the last thing they needed.
Yeah.
So, they thought the optimizing choice for us here is just switch in Harris for Biden and get everybody in line immediately. And, as a tactic, I can't fault them for that. I mean, it kind of rubs me the wrong way as, a small D Democrat, but what are you going to do?
It's machine politics, where the personality at the top of the ticket does not matter as much as the ability to unify the coalition. And what we saw in the media aftermath of the switch is Democrats were all able to get on the same page. Think about how we haven't heard much from progressives complaining about Harris abandoning some of her more liberal policy positions. Why is that? It's not because this is a debate over policy among Democrats. It's a debate over who can beat Joe Biden. That was Harris.
I wrote a piece calling him the Vince Lombardi Democrat.
Yes.
Winning isn't everything. It's the only thing.
It's the only thing.
Think they've all taken that lesson on board.
Well,
and meanwhile, while Democrats are unified, Donald Trump has been painfully unable, at least during those couple of weeks, to switch gears and focus specifically on Harris, as she's ready to say, all right, let's make this a referendum on the guy who isn't the incumbent, but let's pretend that he is.
And yet, what's interesting is that after the assassination attempt, as we talked about, you see Elon Musk go full in on Donald Trump. We later learned he had given a lot of money to Ron DeSantis, but he's someone who refers to himself as kind of a former Democrat. And what it seems like Donald Trump starts doing, obviously he had Dr. Phil at Madison Square Garden, we'll get to that, but it also seems to me like he is putting together this weird coalition. Like, you still have the Never Trumpers out there who are going just as hard as they did in 2016, if not harder now. So the Republican Party it hasn't been patched up completely. But he is definitely bringing some new people into it. Some of them happen to be billionaires. Others, Roy, you've studied this closely, are people who probably voted for Obama, Trump, Biden, and are all in on Trump now. Who is that voter? Is it someone who's motivated by what happened in Butler and Trump's response to it, the strength, the masculinity? What's going on there?
Well, I mean, we won't really know how many of these people are until, we get the final results and can look at the entrails of the AP Norc Vodcast and other polls.
The entrails.
and figure out what's going on. But I mean, clearly there's a substantial constituency out there of people who either didn't vote or, maybe voted for Biden in 2020. And they tend to be working class. And they're not just white, of course. There's a lot of non-whites there who basically don't like the Biden Democratic Party, didn't like the Biden administration, didn't like the inflation, didn't like the immigration, and they kind of like the fact Trump is more their guy. They like that kind of. It's not just macho; it's kind of that authoritative leadership kind of thing, and the no bullshit. I think people underestimate how important Trump's authenticity is to his appeal. He is not scripted. He's just not. We talked about it. He does the weave. Yeah. You don't know what the guy's going to say, and it's kind of like, yeah, that's the way I talk with my buddies. I think that makes a difference. Whereas Harris is actually completely the total antonym, right? Everything she says is scripted down to hello and how are you? So that's a real contrast, and I think it's to Trump's benefit among working class people who have questions about the Democrats, their administration, and their whole style and cultural outlook, which, they think a lot of Democrats look down on them. And you know what? They're right. But Trump, he doesn't look down on me. As he famously said, I love the poorly educated.
Yes, he did.
A new development.
Deep cut.
A new development this election cycle seems to be the mainstreaming of podcasts. And just like Donald Trump went over corporate media's head with his Twitter account, he seems to have done something similar with Joe Rogan, Buzzing with the Boys, the Nelk Boys podcast, these programs that have millions of followers and where he can do a hour and a half authentic interview where he's talking about everything and anything. And
Weaving away.
Yeah. And it might not be, with someone who's up to date on all of the policy questions, but he can come across as authentic. The question that I have is whether or not these podcasts that cater in particular to young men will lead to young men actually going to the polls. John Della Volpe has done a ton of work on this. One of the lowest propensity voters out there currently is the young white male. And so if this works, it's going to be brilliant, and certainly he will have developed a new playbook. If it doesn't, are we going to be looking back at the sort of Trump bro vote in the same way that we looked at Bernie Sanders bros in 2016? Yes, there's a lot of passion and there's a lot of excitement, but do they actually get to the polls?
Yeah, that's absolutely true. That is really the big question in a way. I think if the low propensity voters do show up, particularly these people who've been appealed to through podcasts, I think Trump wins the election. But there's so many reasons to question whether that'll happen. So it's a fascinating bet. And, I don't really, people always ask you, what's your gut about this? I don't have a gut on it. I don't know. It's unknowable at this point. I could see it either way. So I think that's an incredibly interesting question to follow in terms of the election results.
Now, the next moment is, I think, somewhat related to what we were just talking about in terms of both candidates' appeal or lack thereof with certain demographics, especially in the industrial Midwest. And it is when J.D. Vance kind of doubled down on pets being eaten by Haitian immigrants in Springfield, Ohio. And he had mentioned this before he was even plucked for the vice presidential nomination. But the Beltway conventional wisdom is that this was an abject disaster for the Trump campaign. Trump mentions they're eating the cats, they're eating the dogs, they're eating the pets in his debate with Kamala Harris, which we'll get to eventually. But before that, there's like a couple of weeks of just chaotic, frenzied attempts to find eaten pets in Springfield, Ohio. This is and Roy, you'll probably know these numbers better than I do. I believe it's about a 52,000 person town that has seen an influx of some 15,000, 20,000?
10 to 15. I mean, the numbers are all over the place, but yeah, probably at least 10,000, probably more.
So
there's a lot in a small town, let's face it.
Right, and there had been a Haitian migrant driving a van that had ended up killing a school child the year before, and finally the New York Times does kind of a deep dive into what's happened in Springfield after more and more attention comes to how Republicans are sort of preying on this issue of the pets being eaten in Springfield and that it's racist, which was something that was talked about over and over again. I look back on this as an incredibly important moment of the race, and I think partially because my suspicion is that the Beltway conventional wisdom is wrong, that this was helpful to the Trump-Vance campaign, because anytime Democrats spent talking about immigration this cycle was bad for them. It seems as though I'm being met with skepticism by both of you. So, Roy, what did you make of how that changed the race?
Well, it's an interesting question, right? I mean...
this is your issue. This is your...
I mean, there's no question that the Democrats, Harris, are really disadvantaged by the immigration issue to this day. I mean, while there's been some diminution of Trump's advantage on the economy, it's really been pretty stable on immigration, and it's a pretty wide gap. And what people typically advise in terms of campaigns is you don't want to talk about the issues that are A, salient, and B, don't hurt you, right? So and there's a logic to what you're saying. I mean, everybody was suddenly talking about immigration. On the other hand, right, the other side of it, obviously, is the cost would be that it sounds friggin' crazy, and it just feeds into the narrative that these people are xenophobic, racist, beyond the pale, will say anything. And in that sense, it clouds the issue of what is the real effect of immigration, because there's a very reasonable case to be made that immigration on that level, certainly the sort of whole immigration policy by administration is bad in many ways. When you actually have this aggregation of immigrants, even if most of them are nice people in a small town, it actually does have negative effects. It actually is a problem. It is something voters are concerned about. But if you associate it too much with something that's completely out there, then maybe that attenuates the advantage you would have just from more people talking about immigration. So honestly, I think it's hard to net out. What do you think, Philip?
Well, in the Sunday shows afterwards, J.D. Vance said something akin to, well, the story might be fake, but the concerns are accurate, right? I forget the exact line there. And certainly there was this belief that while this inflammatory claim might not bear out, at least it got the mainstream media to start talking about immigration. I'm not certain whether this helps them or not in the end. Donald Trump is of the opinion that immigration is going to be the make or break issue, not the economy this time around. But what I will say is that any Democrat or anyone in the media assuming that they finally have the example of Donald Trump being just too far out there. After a decade plus of this guy being
very
in politics,
skeptical of
the
that.
crazy is baked in. And so there's almost... voters almost said in 2016, all right, we don't mind paying a premium on someone who might be unpredictable if we can get good results. And they liked the results. And so I think the reason why the race is this close, and remember, Trump never led Biden in the Real Clear Politics average in 2020. Now he's ahead by, I think Harris might be ahead by about a point. It's within the margin of error.
It's a tie at this point in the national average.
But the idea that Donald Trump is of bad character or that Donald Trump is
Stop
is
the
erratic.
presses.
Yeah.
He's a weird dude, man. Yeah,
That's going to change everything.
But this is why I thought the Springfield situation only served to highlight that, like, it put some cold, hard numbers on something that in different parts of the country is maybe amorphous. If your community has not seen massive influxes of migrants, I mean, some, like Springfield, have been pockets that are just getting hit worse than others. You know, you have a certain community, they haven't seen many people who have been brought, because that had a particular factory where some Democrats were immediately in this odd position of defending this factory owner as though he was the definitive source. This pretty well-to-do guy in Springfield who had got all these
I love my
migrants.
low-wage workers.
Yes, exactly. And so to me, it just seems to highlight a case that people really hadn't heard about. And Roy, I think you were quoted in the New York Times recently because some Republicans and conservatives have been using older work of yours, famous landmark book of yours, to substantiate their claims.
Basically they're being brought in to swell the Democratic ranks.
Right. And
I said I didn't think that was really it, but anyway.
Yes. So what is your sense of how this is all? I mean, Philip just says accurate. Trump thinks
just to kind of
immigration.
support your sort of assessment. I mean, I think the other side of this, or you're going to make that argument, you could definitely make the case that why people thought it was a slam dunk, on the Democratic side for the Democrats was because, the way it got covered, in the mainstream media, the way, people are absorbing it within the circles, the people writing about this stuff, they're in a bubble. So if you're in the bubble, something like this hits and it's like, whoa, this is incendiary. This is the worst thing ever, accusing them of being cats and dogs, these racist scum. But that's them. That's their view. Right. I mean, so the question is how many people, maybe it really was confined, the outrage maybe was really confined to the people already pretty hardcore anti-Trump and think Vance and think they're the worst people in the world already. So, and again, that's I think it's an empirical question one we can't adjudicate. How many other people were there who weren't in the bubble, who had sort of open minds about the issue of immigration or whatever, who or were leaning toward Trump because there's too many immigrants, but that's going too far. Talking about eating little kitties and puppy dogs, that's just too much.
Which, by the way, we don't know that any Haitian migrants.
Right. No, it did lead some of the greatest memes I've ever seen. The ones where Trump is saving the cats. Those were great. I just
He's a content machine.
Yes.
But then beyond that, I think Victor Davis Hanson makes this point a lot, which is that Donald Trump has substituted class for race. And whereas Democrats might be going to a particular demographic and saying, we're going to right this historic wrong, Donald Trump goes to them and says, your race is not fundamentally the most important thing. What is important is that regardless of your minority or majority status here, the elite and the leadership is ripping you off. Things are not getting better for your life. It's fundamentally a question about fairness. Yeah. And so that New York Times story that you were referencing, it was a fair story because it pointed out that there were costs to massive migration and that someone had to bear those costs. And it was this little town in Ohio, really far away from the coasts. And certainly I did chuckle when, the landlords and the factory owners were seen as these great heroes. But, it did force a conversation about that. So will it be determinative? I don't know. But
I think the more time that people in the media spent calling well-intentioned people in Ohio or people concerned about Springfield, Ohio, racist, the better it was for Trump. That is my hot take on this particular issue.
Well, I think, Phyllis, what's very important about, people talk about how Trump is the big racist. And obviously, he's kind of dicey in some ways. But, I mean, a lot of his appeal is about that fun. And that's why he's getting more non-white support, I think. It's like those people are the elites. They're the people who run things. I'm for you. It really is an appeal across race to class position, to non-elite position, to non-professional position, to the great unwashed out there. It's like they all look at you the same, whether you're white, black, or polka dots, So I think that's crucial to his appeal. And I think this is a single thing Democrats have the most trouble understanding. Yeah. They just don't get it.
So on the question of immigration, you can have all the white papers you want from think tanks saying illegal immigration is a net boon to the economy.
Right, And increases aggregate welfare.
We need to increase the size of the workforce. The average voter isn't going to read those white papers. They are going to look at the chaos, and the fundamental question is going to be, is this fair? I did everything right, and I'm not getting ahead. And now all of a sudden, the federal government is making exceptions for.
Well, and they also think they should, in a democracy, we should decide who gets in. It isn't like you show up at the border and then you get ushered in. We should have a policy that determines who gets to come in and who does not, who gets to be a citizen and who does not. That's a fundamental aspect of being a nation, which I think means a lot and is more intuitive to, your average voter, especially working class voter, than if we let in a lot of immigrants, it's going to increase aggregate welfare because it's going to bring down consumer prices and, it's going to increase GNP. I mean, this stuff is ludicrous. It does not appeal to these voters. I mean, speaking of Brookings, I was actually at a panel the other day when I was, with some people who did, economists who did work in immigration, that sort of thing. And I was there to kind of give the political perspective, I guess. And they just couldn't believe what I was saying. I mean, look at our report. It shows that immigration is the greatest thing since sliced bread, and that people who are against it just don't understand their interests.
And look at how Harris is even moderated on this issue as well. She called the wall stupid when she was running for the Democratic nomination. Now she says that she would back that bipartisan border bill. Certainly Republicans have their gripes with it, but she's no longer saying that any type of border enforcement is racist or unacceptable.
Well, that's why I wrote this piece the other day that got around a lot. The progressive moment is over. I think that whole shtick about immigration, about crime, about race. I mean, I think they're backpedaling from that, and I think it's smart to do so. I mean, I don't know how sincere it is, but I think that the day in the sun for the quasi-open border immigration advocacy thing in the Democratic Party is over. But the problem is, it's very confusing what will take its place.
Yeah.
Koch brothers hardest hit.
Yes, Koch brothers hardest hit. Well, and there was a post from Noah Smith, No Opinion, that was kind of an interesting compliment to your piece. As a progressive, he writes about how he was on the forefront of trying to mainstream
now that
some
I think
of this.
about it, maybe it was a mistake.
And he said it was a mistake not just for political pragmatic purposes, but also he thought the policies. He had soured on some of the policies.
The funny thing was, in the same piece he talked about crime. Said, well, I realize now in retrospect that the idea that policing doesn't deter crime was actually probably not a good thing to talk about, and probably wasn't true. There's a lot of evidence that police matter. It's like, oh, thanks, Noah. You finally figured it out, buddy.
Yeah, we just had to run the experiment on actual human beings to get the answer to that question. The next moment, I was torn between a few different options. First was the non-endorsement from the Teamsters. They declined to endorse Kamala Harris. And polls showed that they had, among their own workforce, the voting Teamsters, Harris was doing much less well than Biden had been among voting Teamsters. Then I was torn about whether Kamala Harris coming out and endorsing no tax on tips, obviously a huge, huge deal in the swing state of Nevada that's following Trump's lead on that. But what I ended up on for this moment was actually Donald Trump endorsing free IVF, government-covered IVF, because we've all seen the polls. This has been dubbed the gender gap election, that the gender gap is going to be the largest in recent history between the Democratic presidential candidate and the Republican presidential candidate. And I think that neutralized the IVF question in a way that actually staunched the bleeding for Donald Trump, that this gender gap could be even more significant if Donald Trump, because Democrats would be running even more ads specifically on Trump taking away IVF or J.D. Vance taking away IVF. But again, I feel like as though I'm being met with skepticism, at least from this side of the table. So, maybe we could even have a conversation about which one of those moments deserves to be in the spot. To me, that one was hugely significant. I'll start with you because you seem skeptical.
Donald Trump comes out there and says that he's the father of IVF.
The father of IVF. That's what he said.
It's like the way the Soviets used to say they invented everything. I love it.
It is very Soviet.
Was he able to stem bleeding on this issue? I'm not certain. Obviously, abortion is an issue that has Republicans on the back foot. Surprise, surprise, those social conservatives who spent half a century in politics trying to overturn Roe v. Wade were serious about it, and now Donald Trump, after sending, his justices to the Supreme Court, gets that decision overturned, and now sort of the Pandora's box is open. With IVF, I think that, Republicans, clearly there's some daylight between them and social conservatives on this one. Social conservatives are no longer demanding entire ideological conformity, and maybe he has gotten away with this. We've seen Harris in the final days of the Trump campaign not necessarily make the IVF argument so often, and that might have to do with the fact that Governor Tim Walz misrepresented his history.
What a knucklehead.
What a knucklehead.
Yeah. Well, but remember, they're also running against the father of IVF.
Yeah, they are running against the father.
Yeah.
But instead just asserting that Trump would enforce a national abortion ban. So I'm not certain how this one totally
Yeah, I mean, I think
works.
the latter point is key in the sense that it wasn't so much that obviously it didn't turn the abortion issue. Abortion was still terrible for Trump and the Republicans, but it did sort of reinforce the signal that I'm not going after this reproductive rights stuff. I mean, there will be no national abortion ban. I love IVF. In fact, they're going to make it free. I mean, it just underscores his basic, like, not a typical, hardline conservative pro-life Republican, which of course he is not. So, and I think that undercuts, sort of staunches the bleeding a little bit. I think it doesn't turn the issue in any real way, obviously. I mean, if you look at the polls, Harris has the massive advantage on who can best handle abortion. So would it be worse if he hadn't said and done some of these things, maybe including the IVF thing? I don't know, but I think that's quite possible because it is the single best issue for the Democrats, and they know it. So they will take any opportunity to push it, including these unbelievable ads they've been running with, you don't have to tell, your vote is secret.
Yes.
And all those horrible
The
other
Julia
people.
Roberts ad.
Right. Oh, God.
Is
So
there
that clearly is subtext there is about abortion more than anything else, I think.
Yeah, they say it's the last place where you have a right to choose. Now,
right,
I actually talked to, on the show, I had a Democratic strategist on the other day who said he believes that Republican women whose husbands are voting for Trump is the swing factor, the hinge vote. They're educated and they're in the suburbs, and those ads are actually going after a real demo. It might not be huge, but it might be enough to make a difference.
I'm always very skeptical of these people who allege they know what the key tiny swing constituency is that is micro-targeted by a particular ad and will determine the race. All I got to say is an unequivocal maybe.
It's
maybe.
an unequivocal maybe, though,
maybe.
so to be fair. Yeah.
Is it going to be one thing? Certainly abortion is going to matter a lot to suburban women.
It's on the ballot.
But are we going to say that that's more important than inflation? Are we going to say that immigration is not also a motivator here? It's not going to be one thing or two things. It's going to be a confluence of many.
But let me talk about the gender gap for a moment,
please
because
do.
this is one of my little hobby horses these days. The concept is there will be a bigger gender gap in this election. And I think that's true. The problem is, or the thing that people aren't really thinking straight about, is what is going to widen that gender gap? Is it the case that Harris is going to carry women by way more than Biden did in 2020? Or is it the case that Trump is going to carry men by way more than he did in 2020, or what's the combination of the two? And as for, you look at the data over and over again, it does not scream that she's getting a much higher vote share among women. It screams that Trump is getting a bit greater vote share among men. So in other words, if the gender gap according to Catalyst in 2020 was, I think, 18 or 19 points, right? And now it's maybe up to 24, 25 points. That's mostly, in most of the polling I see, and the averages in particular, because men are now more likely to vote for Trump. So that widens the gap, even though his vote share, Harris's margin among women is pretty similar to what Biden had in 20. Now, maybe that won't turn out to be true. I mean, I've got an open mind about this, but it's just interesting. People think gender gap and they think, oh, great for the Democrats. Not true at all. And that gets back to something we were talking about earlier. It might be the case that, this widening male vote for Trump is really being driven by these low propensity voters. So maybe that won't obtain, and maybe we'll get, Harris will get more support among women, so we'll truly will have a gender gap that's attributable primarily to increasing support among women. But we don't know that. But, again, if you were to reason off of the actual data, on average, it just does not look like, like, for example, the margin is 10 points or 8 points or even 5 points wider for Harris among women than it was for Biden in 2020. That's just not the case that I can see. There are some polls, you'll see it, but if you average them, I'm not seeing it.
Well, without getting into the Madison Square Garden rally itself, just one question based on what Roy just said. Is the Trump campaign campaigning like it has a serious woman voter problem, because after the Madison Square Garden rally, Megyn Kelly, Nikki Haley said it was getting too broy, it was turning women off. Does the Trump campaign seem to think they have a problem when you see him on the trail?
The theory of the case of the Trump campaign is that they had already done all the events that they could do in these swing states, and that by going to not just Madison Square Garden, but also Coachella, they could exert pressure from the outside, that these are going to be these mass media moments. And certainly it got the base excited. But it got that bro podcast base excited, not necessarily, the suburban women that he's going to need.
That actually turn out probably at higher rates.
Oh, for certain. Yeah.
And so, is this going to be the critical flaw? Is this going to be what cost Trump the election? I'm not certain, because the twists and turns here is that Tony Hinchcliffe makes that argument. Makes that poor joke of saying that Puerto Rico is a floating garbage island. And Democrats run with this. They make Trump liable for what this comedian said hours before he spoke. And certainly it's his campaign.
Right.
He's the one who invited him there. But then, Joe Biden gives and Joe Biden takes. And with Republicans, he turned trash to treasure when he had the garbage comment.
Well, let's put a pin in that. We're going to get to the garbage, because how could we not?
Okay, all right. So we're going to table the garbage.
Table the garbage, and we'll get to the Trump-Harris debate. We got 3 more moments to go in the Donald Trump and Kamala Harris debate. A lot of the Beltway said he lost. I thought that he lost after having watched it. Polls were a little different. Voters were a little bit more split than the pundit class was, which is not entirely surprising. My big takeaway from that debate is probably that David Muir and ABC News fired up the Trump base even more than it already was, but maybe that's even impossible to keep after the assassination attempt. And then there was the other guy who was caught by the golf course with a gun. I mean, it just keeps getting ratcheted up further and further. That certainly ratcheted up the base further. But what do you think that changed, if anything, Roy? Because you were looking at the numbers, of course.
Well, I mean, I think, by most conventional standards, he lost the debate. There's pretty wide agreement on that. I think after you look at the polling movement after the debate, it wasn't like a big change, but it was somewhat in Harris's direction. It was an event that, was part of the chain of joy. It went back to her initial coronation, the convention, the debate. I mean, it all kind of segued together into one big pro-Harris series of events that were massively, accentuated by the media, which is, it shouldn't be controversial. It's pretty sympathetic to Harris, pretty uninclined to give any Trump campaign the benefit of the doubt on anything. So they loved it, and the base loved it. I mean, so that enthusiasm was out there. And of course, it's always hard to tell with these kinds of things. We just don't know about partisan non-response bias, how much that figures into some of these poll trends. But I think most of it was real, and that Harris was benefiting from an relatively unbroken sequence of positive events of which this debate was part. But one thing it did ensure is, that was going to be the only debate. Trump wasn't going to do one of those babies again. No, sir.
That's right. He did not agree to the CNN one, which turned into a town hall with Kamala Harris and Anderson Cooper. And actually, we didn't include Kamala Harris's coronation speech, her DNC speech, on this list, because I thought it was a very predictable and in a good way for them. It was, it looked like the well-oiled machine. Kamala Harris did what she had to do. But what was interesting in the debate is that I felt Democrats sort of were watching that with bated breath, that they were nervous about how she would perform. She apparently took, a week off to prepare, prepared very hard for it, and came out with a performance I imagine that Democrats were happy
Trump,
with.
Look, Trump cooperated with it. It's almost like he got the memo. Okay, you should react in the following way to the jibes from Kamala Harris, and he did.
He did.
And she hadn't been doing many interviews.
She had not been doing many interviews. She has hidden from the press in a similar way as Biden. Certainly, there's been a little bit more access, but not as much. To connect the DNC speech and her performance on the debate, the one thing that was consistent is that she consistently painted Donald Trump as the incumbent. In a moment on stage, you had to ask yourself, who's actually in charge right now?
Right.
And the Trump campaign had been saying again and again that they wanted to tie her to the failures of the Biden administration. But Harris has been watching Trump for the last decade, like the rest of us. And she was able to bait him into questions of crowd size, into questions of whether or not he inherited his wealth. And all of us knew that this was going to happen. If you spoke with, I spoke with former Vice President Mike Pence ahead of that debate, and he said, do not underestimate her. She is going to have canned lines. She is going to press his buttons. That's exactly what she did. I think this was a coming out moment for her. All of the Democrats who were wary that she wasn't going to be a very good candidate, I think the jury's still out on that. They were at least, satisfied that she was competent, and she was competent in pressing that case, which was, we had 4 years of Donald Trump. Do we want 4 more years of erratic chaos candidate in the Oval Office? She did that to the DNC. She also did that in the debate stage. And then afterwards, Donald Trump was almost taken by surprise that he had to debate not just Harris, but, the two moderators as well.
So I'm very curious about what both of you make on this next moment, which is Robert F. Kennedy Jr. drops out of the race, endorses Donald Trump. He had entered this race as a Democrat, for what it's worth. He then went independent and was pretty negative about Donald Trump, by the way, was kind of tying him to this uniparty system of corruption. They then do this rally called Rescue the Republic here in Washington, D.C. on the National Mall. There's a giant Make America Healthy Again banner. And Maha, that's right. Many of the speakers were outright endorsing Donald Trump, even people that you would actually not even expect to, like I think it's Brett Weinstein and his wife Heather Heying, who's these two kind of Bernie professors at Evergreen State who have since developed their own little sort of proto-Maha coalition over the last several years, have endorsed Donald Trump. Robert F. Kennedy Jr. goes out and gives this powerful or impassioned endorsement of Donald Trump. And that takes the third-party element off the ballot, except for he's still on the ballot technically, and I believe Michigan and Wisconsin, a couple of swing states. But that takes the third-party element out in a way that Hillary Clinton still blames Jill Stein for her loss in 2016. So huge for a number of reasons. Roy, can you talk to us a little bit about if you think Robert F. Kennedy Jr., I was down in Stafford County, Virginia this weekend, talking to Republicans at their tent at a polling place, and they had a cutout of Robert F. Kennedy Jr. In this an hour south of D.C. And I saw people posing with him, and I asked, do people like the Bobby cutout? And they said, yes, he's brought a lot of people into the party. Now, anecdotally, maybe that's true to their experience. Is that true overall?
Yeah, I think, again, this is one of the things we really don't know with any certainty. I think at the margin, Kennedy taking himself out of the race probably helped Trump, but is having him associated with Trump, being a Trump supporter, is that more good than bad for the Trump ticket? I think that's a little hard to tell. I think there are people who really think Kennedy is totally wigged out. And says that's another reason not to vote for Donald Trump if Kennedy's going to be influential. On the other hand, there are some people who argue that there's a constituency out there of concerned mothers or whatever who are kind of Kennedy curious, and that actually makes them like Trump a little bit more interested in him. I don't know. Douglas McKinnon, who's no dummy, he wrote a column in The Hill where he argued that this was there were two big mistakes she made in her. Two big problems for Harris's campaign. One is he selected Walz. Bad idea. I agree with that, actually. But then his second one was he thought not only it was significant for Kennedy to drop out and endorse Trump because there actually is this constituency out there of people who are Kennedy curious, interested in his issues, and therefore are more likely to turn out for Trump than they otherwise would have been. I have no idea if that's true. But that is an argument that some people make. I guess if I had to sort of aggregate all those sort of factors, I'd say on net probably doesn't make much difference. But
you're telling us tonight's not going to be a referendum on fluoride in the water?
Probably not. Though, fluoridation in the water. I watched Dr. Strangelove. I know what that's about. It's a commie plot, man.
It sure is. Well, actually, before we get to Philip's take on Bobby Kennedy, Tim Walz, let's just stick on that. Sort of boring conventional pick as far as I'm concerned. You can talk about Josh Shapiro and all of that, but do people even, you've been looking at this for years, do people how much does vice president actually affect what people are doing?
Not much. You can do quantitative estimates of it. Nate Silver did this the other day. At best, it's going to be a marginal effect, but a marginal effect in close election could matter. So, in that sense, it made no sense to pick Walz instead of Shapiro. And also Shapiro, as a number of people have pointed out, and I agree, would have signaled more ideological diversity and the Democratic ticket than picking Walz did. Because despite all the bullshit about him being this like populist, conservative, Midwest, hunting guy, I mean, it didn't compute. I mean, it's not in an important state. He basically is extremely liberal in practically everything the Trump ticket accuses the Democrats and Harris of being. So there's no diversity there.
Never performed well in rural areas.
Once he got out of his district in which he got elected, there's no value added for him in rural. He basically is a creature of the Minneapolis-St. Paul metro.
Yes.
He is. That's just it. I mean, he's beloved by the educated in Minnesota, but not so much the poorly educated. So if the theory was Walz was going to appeal to the Midwestern white working class, I always thought that was highly suspect assumption.
Yeah.
So.
Mm-hmm. Well, as a Midwesterner, Philip, maybe you want to weigh in on that, but also on how the Trump campaign is getting along with Bobby Kennedy's coalition. We saw that Tucker Carlson, it was in Arizona, and he had Bobby Kennedy introduce him. He had, Callie Means introduce. It was kind of a rally. A bunch of speakers from across the spectrum. They all love Donald Trump, of course. That's the one place on the spectrum where they're all in the same spot. But are they getting along? Are these two sort of seemingly disparate factions getting along with billionaire Elon Musk and being married into the MAGA world?
Yeah, it's incongruent. You have Howard Lutnick, who is a billionaire, and Elon Musk, who is a billionaire, and then RFK Jr., who says that it's time for Republicans to stick it to the big banks.
And former Bernie people like the Weinsteins.
Former Bernie people as well.
Yeah.
There have been a lot of conservatives who have tried to find a throughway in MAGA and try and provide some sort of ideological grounding. We saw this from Claremont, from Breitbart, some conservatives in Congress, like Josh Hawley or Marco Rubio.
Or Vance.
Right? Have tried. And I'm not certain, if you take Trump out of the equation, whether or not an RFK is going to, break bread with a J.D. Vance come 2028 or any other Republican. It remains to be seen. But, to your point about vice presidential candidates, certainly they don't deliver elections, but they do deliver momentum. And we saw a lot of people overhyping Tim Walz only for him to underperform at that debate. And we saw a lot of people saying that J.D. Vance was a terrible candidate. And then he had a very good night at that debate when he switched gears and showed an empathy that the media and Democrats didn't think that he had. Again, will that be determinative? No. But, it's helpful with momentum.
Right. I mean, this was the J.D. Vance that got publicized. I mean, even before that, he gave 1 million interviews.
He sure
all
did.
Kinds of, hostile and not hostile. And he was great, I mean, he's totally thinks on his feet, smart guy. I mean, comes across well. But people got to see it on the national stage, and also see that Walz really was kind of a knucklehead.
And think about this, Walz, in the lead up to the DNC, he wrote the Democratic playbook saying, call these guys weird, they're creepy, and oh, by the way, I don't know a lot of people from my back home woods in Nebraska who went to Yale Law School.
Right.
Well,
it's so hilarious.
Shouldn't you be celebrating the fact?
Every other person in the Democratic elite is from Yale
Exactly.
Law School, so.
All of the speakers on stage at the Democratic National Convention, from Cory Booker to any number of them, they either went to Yale or they went and have Ivy on their resume. And then all of a sudden, Tim Walz got to meet the Ivy League man. And it seems like he got his clock cleaned because Walz was agreeing.
And he kind of liked him.
He was agreeing with Vance. And this was the one moment of civility that we saw.
What progressives were so excited about Tim Walz because they felt as though the Democratic elite represented by Kamala Harris, someone from California, very close to business interests, had signaled that they were folding the progressives into the movement. This was their olive branch to the progressives who said you can win in a rural Midwestern state by leaning fully into trans inclusivity, abortion, all of these culture war issues, BLM. And I guess that sort of fizzled, Roy.
Yeah, I mean, it was like an Eastern Democratic elite's idea of what a white working class guy from the Midwest should be like. I mean, they're ideal type.
Amen.
And of course, completely no relation to actually existing white working class guys in the Midwest.
In the Midwest, if someone goes to Yale Law School from a small community, it's pretty cool. You're really proud of that.
It's an American success story. What's wrong with upward mobility, for Christ's sake?
We don't like the elites, but we like our elites who came from us and made it and climbed the ladder.
Exactly. Well, this is the last item on the list here, is Donald Trump at Madison Square Garden on the Sunday before the election, or the Sunday before the election, the Sunday that opens the final week of the election, and then Kamala Harris going and doing a rally at the Ellipse here in Washington, D.C., which is where Donald Trump rallied his own supporters on January 6th before some of them went over and sacked the United States Capitol. Now, Trump's rally, I was watching it without Twitter. I was cooking and cleaning, so I was just listening. I didn't have the Beltway in my ear while I was watching it. I'd missed the Hinchcliffe part of it.
Sure.
By the time I got down to it, I was like, well, this was very well orchestrated. This was very powerful. He had people from all different sides of the political spectrum, celebrities who are beloved, like a Dr. Phil, with Middle America in the heartland, giving really powerful, emotional, personal endorsements of Donald Trump. Then I get on Twitter after the rally, and I see the Tony Hinchcliffe
Katie
stuff.
Bar the door.
Absolutely blown up. There are a lot of Puerto Rican voters in Pennsylvania.
Right.
Kamala Harris's rally was also very well orchestrated. Didn't seem to have any hitches. Didn't have her own Tony Hinchcliffe situation.
There's no insult comic.
Yes, exactly. Which is, an interesting move. Leaving out the insult.
Jen O'Malley Dillon forgot to book one.
Yes.
I mean, they had George Lopez, but that was different.
He was the night before or something.
Yeah.
Right. Now, a lot of Puerto Rican voters in Pennsylvania, as I mentioned, although I think most of them are in Allentown, which is not a county that goes, it's not really a swing county, so it's pretty deep blue, or pretty blue.
No, I mean, it's, the whole area is fairly swingy, the Lehigh Valley.
Interesting.
Allentown's just one part of it, right?
Did you think Hinchcliffe made a big difference in the Pennsylvania vote, or just marginal again? We don't know.
Yeah, I mean, the safest answer, and usually the correct answer is marginal, and we don't know. But, I mean, between these two events, the Ellipse thing and the MSG thing, I mean, the MSG thing is more potentially important. I think the Ellipse thing was, it was fine. It was like people who are into Harris paid some attention to it. It's like, oh, this is great, But I don't think it had a big footprint in the national consciousness. But I think the MSG thing, because basically they primed the pump before that rally happened, right? Because this was like, I mean, it is impressive how absurd some of these attack lines become, but they work, or they seem to work. It's kind of like, well, there was a Nazi rally in 1939.
Yeah, oh my gosh.
The old Madison Square Garden. So therefore, this is like it. What? That makes no sense. But, they were priming the pump with this stuff, that this was, same kind of thing, a sort of quasi-fascist, rally of the deplorables who are going to show up, and it's going to be so terrible. It's just really terrible. Very Nazi stuff. And then they found something to hang it on. A media and a sort of democratic-leaning ecosphere that was already primed to pay attention to this got it with the Hinchcliffe joke, right? And so that was just maximally pumped up. It couldn't have been pumped up anymore. And, then it wasn't too hard to find. Obviously, people were going to denounce it, but it wasn't that hard to find Puerto Rican activists who would denounce it. There were some Puerto Rican celebrities who denounced it in stern terms, and one who even, I guess, changed their support, or at least came out for Harris. I forget which one it was. They got about the maximum bang for that buck that they possibly could. The question is how much, and it's really close to the election. Yeah. So did that really matter? I mean, one thing that we're not seeing a lot of movement in the Pennsylvania polls, and it would be hard for a population as small as Puerto Ricans within Pennsylvania to really drive that result very much anyway, but we're not seeing it in the polls. And one thing I thought was funny is I think they tried to have a rally.
Where
Trump
Byron York reported this. Yeah,
right, it was like 30 people there, It's not the Puerto Rican community is outraged with this. This is like the worst thing ever. Those racist swine, we're going to show them. And of course, nobody showed up, probably because it's just not that big an issue with the Puerto Rican man or woman on the street. That said, it's possible this might knock some people away from Trump in the Puerto Rican community who might have at least been considering voting for him. I don't know. I don't think there's any good evidence either way, but it's certainly possible. But, generally, I mean, beyond the Puerto Rican community, it just, the narrative about Trump and his campaign is they're crazy fucking people. Yeah. They've got the worst ideas and inclinations in the world. You don't want them to get back in. So in that sense, it sort of comported with the national message of the Harris campaign about how risky a second Trump presidency would be. So that probably helps a little bit. But again, I'll stick with my marginal, I don't know, take on the thing.
Was the Trump camp happy with the rally?
They were thrilled, and I don't think they expected Hinchcliffe to become the headline in the way
How
that
could they
it
not
did.
expect that? That's my question. I mean, it's so obvious given the way the media ecosystem works.
There's some reporting that it was a mid-level Trump staffer who greenlit Hinchcliffe. I'm not certain how this all came about. Certainly, we've seen.
But I thought they even saw his remarks beforehand.
Yeah, they took out some of the remarks, but not all of them.
And he's friends with Joe Rogan, and Trump had just been on Rogan's show.
Had just been on Rogan. Rogan is friends with Tucker. Tucker appeared on Tony Hinchcliffe's podcast. I mean, there's a whole ecosystem separately. The question now, and I think that, Roy, you did a good job setting this out, is, what is going to matter more? Is this remark going to motivate persuadable voters to vote against Donald Trump, or is it going to just harden the resolve of partisans? And I think that the same question can be applied to the remarks by Joe Biden in the follow-up. Because this was an in-kind contribution to the Harris campaign. This was an unforced error.
They probably sent a nice thank you note.
Very happy. And then Joe Biden turns around, makes these remarks, and appears to call Trump supporters garbage. There's this whole debate over the apostrophe.
That's one thing I wonder about. I mean, that whole debate thing, does that harden and resolve me? Because it was such bullshit. I mean, they didn't, they basically put Hinchcliffe, practically hung him from the lamppost, and then Biden says X, and they're running around trying to explain it away.
You have a warm-up act versus the president of the United States.
Right.
Who has more influence is going to be paid more attention to. I don't think that this White House was let off the hook on the garbage gate, because the day after it happened, you had at least a dozen questions in that briefing room directed at Karine Jean-Pierre. And certainly then there's the controversy over whether or not the White House improperly edited the transcripts. This thing had some legs, and Donald Trump was...
If you're explaining, you're losing.
But if you're entertaining, you're winning. That's his theory of the case.
That's all.
And certainly after McDonald's, with the garbage truck stunt, he was able to entertain once again. I don't know if Hinchcliffe's going to be a negative. I don't know if Garbagegate is going to be a negative.
Maybe it's just a wash. I don't know.
So, but this is the McDonald's point is, I think, an important one, because it seemed to me like, even looking at the polling, the last 2 to 3 weeks, Donald Trump had momentum, and Kamala Harris actually had started oversaturating herself in the media, had a pretty bad appearance on The View, had a very rough interview with Bret Baier in mid-October, and it seemed as though her momentum was stalling, if not regressing, as Donald Trump was getting momentum and starting to tighten the gap in key swing states. He does his McDonald's event sort of in the middle of that. It seems to keep boosting him. He goes to Joe Rogan. It keeps boosting him. And then the Madison Square Garden rally happens.
Sure, yeah.
Rose, is that your sense?
I think that's a plausible take, that it interfered with Trump's momentum and sort of pushed the needle back a little bit the other way, just in almost in a vibe sense, right? So I think that's plausible.
Historically, as you've studied these elections, how much did the vibes and momentum end up bearing on or reflecting on the ultimate result?
Well, that's a good question, and it's by definition not answerable, because vibes is like, you know it when you see it, right? It's hard to measure, it's hard to analyze quantitatively. I mean, we kind of, it's closely connected to like vague senses of momentum and all that, but no, I don't think we know. I don't think we know. I mean, it's just, I remember when, actually a while ago, before the mini Trump surge started, I was talking to some people I respect, Patrick Ruffini and Sean Trendy, and they both said, yeah, I think things are, right now I'm maybe a little happier to be, if I would rather be the Trump campaign than the Harris campaign. I said, why? I mean, nothing's really changed that much. Well, there's this, there's that, but it's like the vibes, so I got it. I knew what they were talking about, but it's kind of like there's the hard data that explains some of the variance, and then there's the residual that you interpret as you see fit based on your assessment of the vibes and other factors. So I think that's part of what that's about. So, I mean, that's a long-winded way of saying who the hell knows,
Well, before we wrap Philip, actually, you were the first person who reported on Project 2025, if I'm correct. Yeah. And that's one thing that's not on this list, partially because there's no single Project 2025 moment other than the DNC when they had a giant book of Project 2025 out on the stage, which the Heritage Foundation staffers found hilarious because they didn't even have a giant copy of Project 2025. But I left that off because it seems as though they've turned the volume down on that. Democrats have in the remaining weeks of the election. You still see it in some ads saying this is Donald Trump's Project 2025 agenda, because it sounds kind of mysterious and bad, and I'm sure it's focus grouped, and they've gotten it.
Yeah, it's like the protocols of the elders of Zion or something.
Yes.
I broke the Project 2025 story in 2022, and dozens of people read that story. No one cared about it. Local think tank promises to churn out white papers. Story at 11.
Really?
There is something significant to this, and that you had Heritage circling the wagons, drawing the conservative constellation to itself. But in the moment, this was seen as sort of your blocking and tackling, nothing that unusual. You're right, though, in that this was a blank canvas, 900 pages of things that Harris.
So very much not a blank canvas.
Well, not a blank canvas, but like she could of course, transpose the fears of Democrats onto this.
Exactly,
she could have examples beyond just what we had seen in the last 4 years of Trump when he was in office. I think this could have been, an unforced error, because it certainly made the Trump campaign unhappy that you had conservatives who were saying, no, we're serious about this abortion issue. No, we're serious about debt and deficits.
Right.
Whereas, Donald Trump and J.D. Vance, they wanted to run on vibes. And the vibe was that the Biden economy is not great, and we're going to fix it. Don't worry about the details; those will come later. And Heritage sort of, stepped on the Republican campaign there by being overeager and showing up with some answers.
Yeah, I think that's all correct, and I think that on the Democratic side, they looked at it as a bit more of a gift than it really was. I mean, I think they tried to push hard in it, and I know just from my unscientific sampling of my liberal friends that it had been absorbed into the litany about how terrible Trump is and how his administration would be terrible. But these are not the people who were going to vote for Trump. It just became part of the overall shtick against Trump. And I think one reason why they turned the volume down and eventually is it just wasn't making any difference to anyone who made any difference, right? Mm-hmm. And I think that they kind of twigged to that eventually. I mean, it still provides fodder for incredibly lengthy stories in the Post or the Times about the horrors of Project 2025. But I think for any normie voter, it just doesn't matter at all.
Interesting. Very interesting. Well, the last question for you, Philip, is you did some follow-up reporting on Project 2025 when Paul Dance, who was heading it up, ends up getting sort of ousted, and it's dramatic. That does seem to bear on what would happen in a Trump administration. The blood between Trump and Heritage, which had originally been really, that had a positive relationship, it's gotten really negative. I don't think in any way that's trickled out into the Republican electorate, but it certainly affects Republicans in Washington.
Yeah, this has been the side spectacle. You have a gentleman named Paul Dance, who was a mid to senior level bureaucrat in the Trump administration. He comes over to Heritage to run Project 2025, corral not just their white papers, but put together sort of a conservative LinkedIn, if you will, to staff the next administration. Chris LaCivita and Susie Wiles, they warn Heritage again and again, look, we do not want you to give the impression that you're speaking for us. I think that, the subsequent condemnation from the Trump campaign of Heritage has been overplayed. My belief is that relationship has been repaired because, surprise, surprise, it's hard to find 10 to 15,000 employees overnight to staff an administration. But yeah, the knife fighting between Paul Dance on his way out the door, trying to, put Project 2025 at the feet of the Heritage Foundation president, would have been much more catastrophic if Project 2025 was something that was going to, persuade moderate voters, not just Democratic liberal ones that were already in Harris's camp.
Right.
Roy, last question for you. Mm-hmm. As people are trying to piece together the puzzle of this election in real time, results are coming in, thinking where they should be looking. What are a couple of the bellwethers? Your pro tip as people who are maybe looking at their election maps, the New York Times website as the results come in.
Yeah, I mean, I I don't have anything interesting to say here beyond what other people say. I mean, there's so many nice lists out there of key counties to look at, right? Ruffini has them. The New York Times has them. Lots of people have them. And, you want to look at there are counties that will know pretty quickly how they voted on election night. So just take a look at those wherever they might happen to be. Pennsylvania, obviously, we're going to be keeping an eye on, though they're going to count slowly. So we're not sure how that's going to turn out. But there's no dearth of recommendations out there for county level results to watch.
And how should people be interpreting as the elections from Wisconsin and Pennsylvania in particular come in with a lot of early voting, mail-in voting that doesn't get counted until, I believe, Election Day today?
Right.
There was the red mirage last time around. What are we expecting?
Beats the hell out of me, I mean, I think there's different takes out there about what we'll know when and how seriously to take the results that will be available at any particular time of the night or the morning. There's this kind of weird early voting pattern we've seen, and we don't know how much the Republicans are already banking votes that are going to be theirs on Election Day anyway, and how much is meaningful. So who knows? I mean, I would defer to the actual bean counting experts on vote totals, which are available through Wasserman, through Ruffini, through the New York Times. There's actually a good piece in the Liberal Patriot where we run down some of this stuff. But I would certainly say, if there's anything to the extent we can keep track of what's going on in Pennsylvania, I mean, it's not controversial. That's the key state. If it looks like Trump is doing better than the bean counters expected him to do in some of these Pennsylvania counties, to the extent results are available, I mean, that's pretty important.
Yeah.
But, of course, the argument, there's other results that might be available sooner. It's a state that, we know
Georgia comes in pretty quick.
Right. And we know that, they're probably going to take Michigan, the Democrats, at least it's one of their best Midwest states. So if they're overperforming in key counties there, I mean, in other words, they're already going to take the state, but they're overperforming, then that's a sign, right? So it's basically all about under and overperformance in different counties in different states, given the fact that, given how fast the results are coming in, right? So if you get 30% of the vote from County X, looks a little weird, it doesn't really tell you anything because, they count certain ballots faster than others. So, I would say don't watch TV. That's my advice. Because it's completely useless. Just look at some of these sites that actually keep track of the hard data on this stuff and the people who are the county vote watchers and some of their associated Twitter accounts or whatever. That'll tell you more than watching Steve Kornacki, with his sleeves rolled up or whatever. I mean, it's just, and they're also going to feature the exit poll results, probably. Exit poll results, highly untrustworthy at this point. So I wouldn't make too much of those. So yeah, just, stick to your computer. That's my advice.
There you go. And on your computer, you can stream Undercurrents and Unheard. So it's perfect.
Segue.
But it's actually partially why we wanted to do this. Is there's so much speculation in the early hours that ends up just confusing everyone. It certainly did in 2020 and confusing the way that we ultimately digest the election results. So Roy Texiera of the American Enterprise Institute and the Liberal Patriot Substack, Philip Wegmann of Real Clear Politics. Thank you both so much for being here.
Thanks for having us.
All right. Well, make sure to tune in for the Undercurrents late night election night stream. It's going to be a blast. We have all kinds of great people joining us. So we will be back here. Subscribe on the channel, turn on the notifications, go over to the live video. The link is in the description. Give us a subscription on the channel itself, Undercurrents. It helps us so much. Subscribe wherever you get your podcasts. And for the full premium experience over at undercurrents.tv. This has been a marathon tour of the last few months of the craziest election ever. Thank you for tuning in. We'll be back here soon.